Yeah, Joe.
I would like to follow up on many questions you have received over the last 2 days about the attempt of assassinating the Iraqi Prime Minister. I was wondering if you have any updates on that topic.
No.
Nothing?
No.
Could you tell us why the Pentagon is reluctant in accusing Iranian-backed militias of launching those UAVs? When we heard General McKenzie saying that he accused them directly that Iranian-backed militias were behind the assassination, the attempt of assassination.
There's no reluctance here, Joe. We want to be judicious and careful about what we're saying here from the podium. I've said, I don't know how many times over the last couple of days, that these attacks are certainly in keeping with the kinds of tactics and tools and procedures that we have seen militias backed by Iran use in Iraq. But I am not in a position now to speak to specific attribution, and I'm not going to go beyond that. It is under investigation by our Iraqi partners, and I think we need to respect that process and allow the Iraqis to speak to this when and how they're able to.
But don't you think those attacks against the residence of Prime Minister Kazemi are similar to the attacks against At-Tanf in Syria? What's the difference? When we heard the statement from CENTCOM in regards to At-Tanf attacks accusing the Iranian-backed militia, why not now?
Joe, I'll go back to what I just said before. I think we're talking past one another. As I said before, we have seen these kinds of tactics, these kinds of tools, UAVs, used by Iran-backed militias in Iraq to target our people, to target our facilities, and of course to target our Iraqi partners. I'm not walking away from the similarities here. I'm just saying that I'm not prepared to get into specific attribution at this time, nor would it be prudent for me to do that while the Iraqis are investigating this.
Latest news, headliner. Iran likely did not order drone attack on Iraqi Prime Minister, current former U.S. officials say. Dated November 13, 2021, NBC News. Iran likely did not sanction a recent drone attack on the Iraqi Prime Minister, though it was almost certainly carried out by Shiite militia forces that Tehran has armed and supported, current and former U.S. officials told NBC News. The apparent failed assassination attempt illustrated how Tehran has struggled to corral squabbling Shiite militia leaders in Iraq since the U.S. killed a key militia figure and a top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, in January 2020, said a senior U.S. defense official and two former senior U.S. officials. It's fair to say that Iran does not have as much control over these groups since Soleimani was killed, the defense officials say. At least two quadriceptor drones armed with explosives targeted the residence of Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi in Baghdad in the early morning hours of November 7th, but Kadhimi escaped without injury. The explosion blew doors off hinges and smashed concrete stairs on the inside of the building, according to images released by Iraqi authorities. Iran condemned the attack and has denied any role in it. The drone's design and components resembled other quadricopter drones used by the Iranian-backed militia since July 2020, including a number of failed attacks on the U.S. Embassy compound. Current and former officials and regional experts said the militias have been at odds with Kadhimi, who have sought to marginalize the Iranian-backed groups, and their political candidates fared poorly in the parliamentary elections last month. The militias organized protests after the October 10th election, alleging the vote was fraudulent without providing evidence. General Frank McKenzie, the head of the U.S. Central Command, blamed the attack on Iranian-backed militias early this week, and current and former U.S. officials say the weapons used, the tactics, and the target all point to Iranian-backed militias. Douglas Silman, who served as U.S. ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019, said that the assassination of Iraq's prime minister appeared not to be in Iran's strategic interests, as it would unleashing a volatile chain of events on its border. I would be very surprised if Iran ordered a drone strike on Kadhimi. Iran does not want to see a completely destabilized Iraq. They simply want an Iraq that is off balance enough that they can have significant influence, both political and economic, said Silman. The head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, Brigadier General Ismail Khani, paid a surprise visit to Baghdad immediately after the attack, reportedly calling for calm and national unity. Khani is the successor to Soleimani. Soleimani was killed in a U.S. strike in Baghdad along with Abu Mahdi al-Madanis, who was the deputy commander of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces and the de facto leader of the pro-Iranian militias. Khani is believed to exert less influence than Soleimani, who spoke Arabic and had years of experience with Iraqi militias, and no militia figure has attended the authority that Madani's enjoyed, according to Silman and regional analysts. The absence of Soleimani and Muhannis has triggered a power struggle among the militia leaders that is still unfolding. Silman went on to say, I think that tension is as much among the leadership of Iraqi Shia militia leaders as it is between the militias and Tehran. The militias have made a series of political missteps and struggled to maintain their influence since the death of Soleimani and Muhannis. So Michael Knights, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, in which he said, since then, wheels have come off. Norm Rule, who served for 34 years in the CIA and worked on programs related to the Middle East, said Iran's proxies in Iraq are a monolith, and competition among the militias could generate more violence. He also went on to say, indeed, as their political evolution continues, Iran is likely to reduce support for some in favor of others. The former groups just won't go away, and this will be a problem for everyone. The attack also raised questions as to why or allied intelligence agencies did not catch wind of the attack in advance and whether Washington could be providing more security assistance, including counter-drone technology, to protect the safety of top Iraqi officials, former officials, and experts said. The attack also showed that Iraqi and Western intelligence remains insufficient on Iran's proxies in Iraq. We are to be committed to Iraqi stability and preventing similar attacks in the future. The U.S. and other partners must improve their understanding of malicious plans and intentions, Rule said. The CIA and the White House National Security Council declined to comment. While the attack on the Iraqi prime minister did not necessarily serve Iran's strategic goals, Tehran shared some responsibility for the attack given its long-established support for the militias, Rule went on to say. Jerusalem Post headliner Bennett, no matter what happens with Iran talks, we'll defend ourselves, dated November 16, 2021. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, stressed that Israel would defend itself, no matter what happens in the nuclear talks between Iran and the world powers, during a visit to an exercise being carried out by the IDF in northern Israel on Tuesday. He also went on to say, we are surrounded by security challenges, and the goal is to take advantage of periods of relative quiet to build strength. Therefore, we are preparing for various scenarios, both near and far. We are dealing with Iran and its affiliates in Lebanon and Syria, no matter what happens between Iran and the superpowers. And we are certainly concerned about the fact that there is not enough toughness in the face of Iranian violations. Israel will defend itself on its own. During the visit, Defense Minister Benny Gantz stated that we are, of course, following everything happening on all fronts. We are currently seeing Iran's policy within Iran in the nuclear context, as well as its strengthening outside Iran and its influence in Syria and Lebanon. The world must act against Iran, and Israel must continue to do what it needs in every front, in general and in the northern front in particular. Last week, the IDF began a drill in northern Israel as part of what reservists in the 36th Division, also known as the Gash Formation, were called up. About 3,000 soldiers from the Golani Brigade, Armored Corps, Artillery, and Reserve Brigades, along with the intelligence and the Air Force, took part in the drill. Gantz went on to say about the drill, we found that there is a very cohesive and trained system that is gaining more and more capabilities, and I am very happy with what we have seen. State budget has been approved, and this is essentially important for the IDF, which can properly plan its resources, train continuously, and intensively invest everything it needs in preparing for the next war. That's the latest news. Now, my thoughts. In regards to the false news reports about Iran bombing Iraqi prime minister, the problem with that is that the United States convicted Iran in this crime without any evidence to do so. They just implied it. And this seems to be a consistent finding due to the inherent biased nature, due to the pressure of Saudi and Israel lobbies and their governments. And since we are basically in a foreign policy war that is conscripted by neoconservatives in the mid-90s, like the Oded Yanan Plan, the Project for the New American Century, and the Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine, we have made it a war of attrition against these Shiite, Alawite Muslims in the Middle East, who are far better fighters than the brother Arabs, who are being misled due to Western influence and pressures from the Gulf, who are un-Islamic due to their Wahhabi ideology. The Iranian proxies in Iraq are fighting against the Arab fundamentalists like ISIS Khorasan, as well as the Islamic State in Levant in Syria. And wouldn't you know, just like I have said in previous videos, that the United States were once funding and training these Arab jihadists in Syria to try and overthrow the Alawite regime in Bashar al-Assad, who is the president of Syria. And the reason for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani is simple. He was the leading figure in the war against these Syrian jihadists and the jihadists in Iraq through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. With the death of Soleimani, it is a huge victory for the jihadists. There is no threat from Iranian proxy forces against U.S. military personnel, but they will defend themselves against military aggression. And why shouldn't they? We are not at war with Iran. We're at war with terrorism. Terrorism is coming from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia. Why are we not at war with Saudi Arabia? Well, I'll tell you why. It's pretty simple. Oil, black gold, the massive financial donations that are given by these ghoulish rich Saudi princes to our corrupt federal government, those of the Republican and Democratic parties. Both of them are corrupt. As for Israel, well, I mean, isn't this the same old song? Israel will continue to defend itself. Meanwhile, no country on the face of the earth would be suicidal enough to destroy themselves to try and attack Israel. Iran wants a nuclear weapon. Why shouldn't they have one? Israel has many. The United States has many. The Soviets have many. Heck, even Pakistan and India. And they're much more dangerous to world life than Iran. That's a whole nother subject. Iraq didn't have a nuclear weapon. Look what happened to them. Syria didn't have a nuclear weapon. Look what happened to them. Libya didn't have a nuclear bomb. Look what happened to them. Iran's looking. And it's not Iran. It's not the United States who's surrounded by Iranian military bases. It's not Israel who's surrounded by Arab military bases or Iranian military bases. Iran is surrounded by the U.S. military, as well as Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. The only threats of war have come from us and Israel and Saudi Arabia, not Iran. You're not a threat to the United States, Saudi Arabia, or Israel. In fact, more Jews live in Iran than any other place on the earth outside of Israel. And since Naftali Bennett is a hardline right Likud party member, of course, he is not in the position to want peace. The Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, also doesn't want peace. He could care less. He's not a Likud party member, Bennett. He's from the Yamina, which is a political alliance of the right-wing parties. So when you have people of the right who are basically nationalists, the only way to peace for them is through the gun or the missile, or the bomb, as history would dictate to you. There is no peace through the way of the sword. We're either going to have moderate or libertarian voices speaking on the world's behalf. I don't want people like Joe Biden or Samantha Rice or Donald Trump or Mike Pence or Kamala Harris speaking on my behalf. These people know nothing about the world. They are ignorant about the poor, about the needy. These people never knew anything about peace. They're always about turmoil, scheming, stealing, ripping off. We don't want these people at the head of the table. Now give me Ralph Nader. Give me Ron Paul. Don't give me draconian vampires who suck the life force out of the American people, as well as people of other countries. These people only know war. And it's high time that we have to do something about it before time runs out.